Letters from Spain. Letter 15. The darker side of Spain. Hello. I realize that I've spent the last few podcasts comparing Spain and the United States, and usually to show how my own country is lagging behind. But I'm afraid that I'm painting an overly sunny picture of Spain. I mean, overly sunny metaphorically, of course, because Spain, literally speaking, is extremely sunny. This is the sunniest February I've seen in my whole life, probably. It's ridiculous. Beautiful. But as sunny as it is in Spain, it's not a paradise by any means, as any Spanish person would tell you. I do admit, though, that it's a bit harder for me to talk about Spain's shortcomings. Like most people, Spanish people are not very keen on foreigners criticizing their country. And there is a long tradition of foreigners criticizing Spain. Spanish people refer to the leyenda negra, the black legend, which is a tendency among historians, particularly British historians, to treat Spain as backward, cruel, conservative, exotic, uncivilized, etc. There's a long history of this. Well, here, let me give you an example of the black legend. Many people know that the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492 under the reign of the Catholic monarchs. Officially, the Jews were given a choice: conversion or exile, or death, I guess. Well, this is sometimes used as the basis for portraying Spain as a particularly intolerant country, but that's not quite accurate. You may not know that in the course of European history, the Jews were expelled from nearly every European country, sometimes multiple times, and in most of these expulsions occurred much before Spain's 1492 expulsion. Now, of course, all of these wrongs don't make a right. Intolerance is always bad, whether one person's doing it or everyone's doing it. But my point is just that Spain was not exceptionally intolerant in the context of Europe. Well, anyway, I'm not even here to talk about the black legend. I'm here to talk about some of the shortcomings of Spain's economy now. Along with Portugal, Ireland, and Greece, Spain was among the European Union countries that took a big hit during the 2008 financial crash. Recovery was long, painful, and slow. But Spain did turn itself around. And now it has an economy well ahead of Greece's or Italy's or Portugal's. Still, there's cause for concern. I can really report some anecdotal evidence. That's what I mainly have access to. During my time as a teacher, I've come across doctors, lawyers, and engineers who couldn't find a good job. That's concerning enough as it is. Highly skilled workers who can't find a job? Even now, over 10 years later, 10 years after the crisis, unemployment is still alarmingly high. Right now in the United States, it's well below 5%. But in Spain, I think it's around 14%. That is huge. And unemployment among young people as in below 25, is double that. So 28% or 30%. It's just crazy. If we had unemployment rates that high, or even close to that high in America, it would be a catastrophe. So I myself have a pretty distorted picture of Spain's economy. Since I work as an English teacher, in general, native English teachers in Spain have no problem finding a job. There's a high demand for native English speakers. Basically, you're just hired on the spot. So from my point of view, Spain's economy is just great. But of course, the reason why so many people want to learn English in the first place is so they could work in an international business. So the fact that it's so easy for me to get a job is a sign that the best business opportunities are not to be found within Spain itself. But why is this? Now, the main explanation I've heard for Spain's economic sluggishness, and, admittedly, it's an explanation from a particular ideological camp, is that the European Union's economic policies are to blame. For one, it's because Spain shares the euro with so many countries, so Spain can't control its own currency. And that means it can't exert the kind of control that, say, the Federal Reserve, the Fed, uses to adjust the American economy. It exerts a huge effect on the American economy. Another commonly blamed culprit is the economic philosophy of the German-dominated European Union, which is dominated by deficit hawks who insist upon imposing austerity in response to recessions or crises. And they just want to keep the deficit within preordained limits. All right, now don't ask me to explain the details of the European Union's fiscal policy. I'm certainly not an economist or even close to being an economist. But if you want to see the case for why the European Union can be bad for the economies of countries like Spain, you could read Joseph Stiglitz's book, The Euro. I also have a review of it. But anyway, don't think that I'm anti-European Union. I love the European Union. I love the Euro. All I'm saying is that there's a reason why so many young professionals go to Germany and so many people in Spain are out of work. Something is not working right in the Spanish economy. And by the way, the very high youth unemployment rate in Spain is a major reason why so many young Spanish people live with their parents for such a long time, well into their 30s. It's not because Spanish men are mama's boys. I mean, that is true. They are mama's boys. But it's often from economic necessity. They can't find a job. They can't afford to live by themselves. I also should mention, as another aside, that Spain is suffering from much of the same economic problems that we often complain about in the United States. Economic inequality is growing, and social mobility is not high. According to an OECD report, it would take a low-income family 4 generations to reach the country's average income. 4 generations. And what does that even mean? I don't understand how that even works. But anyway, like most places in the world, if you're born poor, it's likely you're going to stay poor. And if you're born rich, you're going to stay rich. This is not the society that most people want to create. Now, the most obvious evidence of Spanish poverty, or the most palpable and undeniable evidence, are the shanty towns. For 3 years, on my bus ride to work, and I was working in Ribas, which is it's on the highway going east towards Valencia. Anyway, every day I could see what was unmistakably a shanty town out the bus window. It was just like you see in pictures of the Great Depression. Improvised shelters made of bits of metal and wood and plastic, all huddled together. It was a settlement on one of the old shepherding trails. Now, there are all these old shepherding trails in Spain that were given a license back in the 1100s. They're called Cañadas Reales. I think they were given a license by Alfonso the Wise, of all people, back in like 1100 something. And they're under a special legal designation for that reason. They're not officially land that can be developed and turned into a municipality. Well, despite that, according to El País, the newspaper, almost 8,000 people were living on this illegally developed land. admittedly, not all of these 8,000 people were living in a shanty town. In fact, some of the houses in the Cañada Real belonged to middle-class families. And of course, this wouldn't be the first time in Madrid's history that an illegally developed land, property, became a thriving neighborhood. This is the case in Lavapiés, which is now one of the most famous and central neighborhoods in the city. But anyway, a lot of people living on the Cañada Real were indeed abjectly poor, without basic access to basic services or infrastructure. Another shanty town I saw for many years was on a bit of undeveloped land behind Madrid's Railroad Museum, which is more or less in the center of Madrid, not particularly far from the central train station Atocha. The authorities were pretty slow in dealing with the situation. Eventually, they came in, they performed a census in both the case of this shantytown and the shantytown in the Cañada Real, and then they tried to offer public housing for the people who qualified, and that wasn't everyone. Then they just came in and bulldozed the shelters. Some people took the offer to go to public housing. Some people just moved on to live in another temporary shelter. Even now, if you go to these places, you could still see bits of rubbish all over the place and blackened concrete left near the Railroad Museum where people would build these big bonfires where they would cook and stay warm. It's all still there. So many of the people who live in these shanty towns are ethnically Romani, also called Roma for short. But these are the people who, in English, we call gypsies, although this term is considered offensive by many people. The word gypsy comes from the word Egyptian, because some people used to believe that they came from Egypt. In fact, they came from India many, many years ago, over 1,000 years ago. So even though the Romani culture has had a great influence on the culture of Spain in general, and particularly on the culture of Andalusia, where it's an essential part of flamenco music, even just, despite this big influence, there's also quite a bit of prejudice against the Romani people in Spain. They're imprisoned in huge numbers, totally disproportionate to their population. And the vast majority of Romani are living below the poverty line. It's like 98%. Many Spanish people are openly hostile to Romani people. Admittedly, the social situation is quite complex, since Romani are traditionally itinerant, as in they don't live in one fixed spot, and they tend to live outside the norms of sedentary society. But, as usually happens, it's difficult to say what's a cause and what's an effect. Are the Romani pushed to the margins by society, by the prejudices of society, or do they live there by choice, or is it a mix of the two? I guess you'd have to ask an anthropologist or a social worker. But I think it's fair to say that the living conditions of many Romani people in Spain are totally unacceptable. And, there are over 1 million Romani people in the country, so they make up a sizable proportion of the population. I think this is an obvious social problem. Well, another person, besides the Romani people, another sort of person who's often pushed to the margins are migrant workers. Just last week, a man named Philip Alston, who's an ambassador from the United Nations, visited a migrant workers camp in Huelva, which is in the south of Spain. What he found was yet another shanty town with people living in what he described as some of the worst conditions he had ever seen in Europe. So here's a little quote from an article in El País. Quote, "People cooked by the light of their cell phones, fetch water from a tap 2 kilometers away, and store it in plastic bottles that were once used for weed killer. They shower outdoors with water heated on a stove and go to the bathroom in the field." End quote. So keep in mind that some of these people have been living like this for a decade or more. They are agricultural temporary workers. Some of them working without permits, residency permits. And they all make around €6 a day, which is close to nothing. Not too far away from Huelva on the southern coast is Almeria. And in Almeria, there's a huge conglomeration of greenhouses. In fact, there's so many greenhouses that you could easily see it from space. If you go on Google's satellite view and look at Almeria, it's like the southern tip of Spain is just covered in a bunch of white and gray. It's hard to describe, but anyway, it's very, very visible. You can't see the landscape at all. Now, this used to be totally arid land, but the greenhouses have made it incredibly productive. In fact, this relatively small amount of space provides a big, big chunk of Europe's fresh produce, fruits and vegetables. But conditions inside the greenhouses are so brutal that the labor is mostly or almost entirely done by migrant laborers from Africa and Eastern Europe. And just like in Huelva, many of these workers live in slums and shanty towns, making less than the minimum wage. 30% of these workers are undocumented. All right, so you could talk about illegal immigrants taking other people's jobs all you want. But the fact is that Spanish people don't want these jobs. It's totally miserable to be working in these conditions. It's like 40 degrees or higher inside the greenhouses, which is well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and it's basically miserable. But some Europeans are happy to have the cheap fruits and vegetables. We're happy to eat the fruit that these migrant workers grow, and we're happy for the low prices. But someone is paying for those cheap prices, and it's these migrants who are being exploited in the south of Spain, who are working and living in unsafe conditions without basic amenities and without government protection. Well, to give you a rounded out picture of the economic and social woes of Spain, I also have to mention the depopulation of the interior. Now, many Spanish villages are emptying out. In the least densely populated area of Spain, which is in the mountains between Cuenca, Guadalajara, and Teruel, the population density is smaller than it is in Lapland. And if you don't know, Lapland is the northernmost region of Finland. So, for years, the whole province of Extremadura has been struggling. Almost half of the people in Extremadura are living on less than €700 a month. That is not a lot. So it's no surprise then that young people are trying their best to move out of these poor regions of the interior and into the cities. But meanwhile, in the cities, decent housing is getting harder and harder to find. Rents perpetually rise, and the rents are rising, at least in part, because so many houses are purchased at higher and higher prices by wealthy people, and then left empty. According to El País, there are almost 3.5 million properties left empty in Spain. Now that's pretty crazy to think about when you keep in mind the people who are living in shanty towns on the edges of the city. So we have beautiful houses with no one in them, and then these little shacks, with people crowded into them. Doesn't make a lot of sense. And in fact, the current socialist government is trying to create legislation to address this problem, but let's see how good they do. I'm not particularly hopeful, to be honest. Anyway, well, there you go. This is the best I could do to talk about some of the shortcomings of Spanish society. The economy is sluggish. There are lots of people out of work. There's a lot of inequality. There's a lack of social mobility. There's a lot of people living on the margins of society. But I do want to end this podcast on a less gloomy note. As even the UN ambassador noted, the one who I mentioned above, what was his name? Philip Alston. As even he noted, the Spanish healthcare system is working quite well, achieving universal coverage. Here's an example. An immigrant named Eva Costizo recently shared what she called a symbolic invoice. And this is what her medical bill would have cost her, and she gave birth to twins, what it would have cost her had it not been for public health care. Now, as an American, this is a little bit hard to even imagine. Someone publicly celebrating not paying a medical bill. This does not happen in America. I just saw an article in the New York Times about a person who received a quote unquote surprise medical bill for $145,000. $145,000. And apparently, at least 20% of Americans get surprise medical bills. And I also read online that 40% of Americans who with cancer have to liquidate their savings when they're fighting cancer. So, I don't think in the United States we have a lot to be gloating about. But I do want to make the listener aware, and myself aware, that Spain certainly has problems of its own. It's not a utopia, even if it is indeed very, very sunny. Thank you.